It was a quiet afternoon when a dog came sprinting down the road, barking wildly and tugging at anyone who would pay attention. Moments later, the police shut down the entire road, and what they discovered left everyone speechless. What could have made a dog so desperate that it begged humans, total strangers, for help? And what was so urgent that it brought the entire neighborhood to a standstill? You won't believe how this one brave animal became a hero. It all started on a regular Tuesday afternoon in a small suburban town, the kind of place where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. The streets were lined with cozy homes, each with neatly trimmed lawns, children playing games like tag and hopscotch on the sidewalks, and parents chatting casually over picket fences. Cars rolled down the road at a leisurely pace, their drivers waving at familiar faces as they passed by. The atmosphere was calm, almost sleepy, like any other uneventful day. But then, out of nowhere, the peace was shattered. A German shepherd came sprinting into view, its paws pounding the pavement, its ears pinned back against its head. Its coat, once sleek and shiny, was dusty and matted, and its tongue lolled out of its mouth as it panted heavily. There was a wild, almost desperate look in its eyes. This wasn't just a dog out for a run or chasing a squirrel. No, this dog was on a mission. The animal darted into the middle of the street, narrowly avoiding an oncoming car that screeched to a halt just in time. The driver leaned on the horn, clearly annoyed, but the dog didn't even flinch. It barked, a sharp, urgent sound that made everyone within earshot stop what they were doing. The dog paced back and forth in the road, barking and growling, as if trying to grab someone's attention. At first, most people ignored it. After all, stray dogs weren't an uncommon sight in the area. A couple of pedestrians waved their hands, trying to shoo it away. "Go on, get out of here," one man called out. But the dog didn't budge. It turned its head toward the man and barked again, more forcefully this time. Its entire body seemed to vibrate with urgency, its tail wagging in quick, frantic bursts. It wasn't scared, it was determined. Drivers began to grow impatient. A few rolled down their windows to yell at the dog or at the pedestrians blocking the way. "Somebody get that mud out of the road," a woman shouted. Still, the dog didn't move. It stood its ground, its sharp barks cutting through the growing commotion. And then something strange happened. The dog stopped barking for a moment, looked around at the people and cars surrounding it, and let out a low, mournful whine. Its eyes, wide and glistening, seemed to plead, "Help me. Please, someone help me." A few people started to notice that this wasn't normal behavior. Stray dogs usually ran off when confronted, especially by a crowd or the noise of honking cars. But this one was different. It wasn't scared or lost. It was trying to say something, to communicate in the only way it knew how. "Do you think it's hurt?" a young woman asked her friend as they watched from the sidewalk. "I don't know," her friend replied, "but it doesn't look like it's going anywhere." The dog continued to pace, its nails clicking against the pavement. Every few seconds, it would stop, glance back in the direction it had come from, and let out a series of sharp, urgent barks. It was as if it was trying to lead the people somewhere, but no one was following. Finally, a man wearing a baseball cap and holding a grocery bag decided to approach the dog. He crouched down a few feet away, holding out his hand in an attempt to appear non-threatening. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly. "What's going on? You okay?" The dog immediately turned toward him, its ears perking up. It barked once, short and sharp, then turned and ran a few steps down the road before stopping and looking back at the man. "Do you see that?" the man called out to the crowd. "It's like it wants me to follow it." Some people in the crowd began murmuring, their curiosity piqued. Could the dog really be trying to lead them somewhere? "Maybe it's just looking for food," someone suggested, but the man shook his head. "No, it's not acting like it's hungry. I don't know. It's different." The dog barked again, louder this time, as if growing frustrated by their hesitation. It ran back toward the man, nudging his leg with its nose, before darting off again. That's when Karen, an off-duty police officer who had been driving by, decided to step in. She pulled her car to the side of the road and got out, her years of experience telling her that this situation was worth investigating. "What's going on here?" she asked, walking toward the small crowd that had gathered. "It's this dog," the man with the grocery bag explained. "It's been acting weird, like it's trying to get us to follow it or something." Karen looked at the dog, her trained eyes immediately noticing the signs of stress and urgency in its behavior. The way it barked, the way it kept glancing back toward the same direction. It all pointed to one thing. The dog needed help, and it was trying to tell them where. Without hesitation, Karen crouched down and called out to the dog. "Hey there, boy. she said gently. "What's wrong? What are you trying to show us?" The dog froze for a moment, staring at her intently. Then, as if sensing that she understood, it barked again and took off down the road. This time, Karen followed. "Come on," she called over her shoulder to the crowd. "Let's see where it's taking us." Some people hesitated, unsure whether to get involved, but a few, their curiosity outweighing their skepticism, decided to join her. As they walked, the dog kept glancing back, its eyes scanning the group to make sure they were still following. The crowd grew as more people noticed the commotion and joined the procession. Drivers parked their cars along the side of the road, and neighbors stepped out of their houses to watch the unusual scene unfold. "Where do you think it's leading us?" someone asked. "I have no idea," Karen admitted. "But whatever it is, this dog is desperate for us to find it." The dog led them down the street, its pace quick but steady. Every few steps, it would stop, bark, and look back, as if urging them to hurry. By now, Karen's instincts as a police officer were on high alert. This wasn't just a random act of curiosity. It was something bigger. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a situation that could be life or death. As the group followed the dog, they left the main road and entered a narrower side street. The houses here were older, their yards overgrown with weeds. The dog seemed to know exactly where it was going, its determination never wavering. The group grew quieter as they walked, the gravity of the situation starting to sink in. What could be so urgent that this dog, a mere animal, was willing to risk everything to get their attention? At first, most people thought it was just another stray, confused, lost, or maybe just a dog with nowhere else to go. After all, strays were common in the area, especially in neighborhoods like this one, where people often left scraps out for them or took them in temporarily. But something about this dog seemed different, even to those who only noticed it in passing. Its behavior wasn't random or aimless. It had a purpose, a kind of intensity that strays didn't usually exhibit. Among those watching was Karen, an off-duty police officer who had been driving through the area on her way home. Karen had always had a soft spot for animals, especially dogs. She'd grown up surrounded by them and had even volunteered at animal shelters during her early years on the force. She knew dogs, how they acted when they were scared, when they were lost, or even when they were just being playful. But this one was different. Karen noticed the way the dog moved, darting back and forth, barking at cars, and glancing at the people around it as though pleading for help. Its energy wasn't chaotic like that of a lost or frightened animal. It was deliberate, focused, and urgent, almost as though it knew exactly what it was doing. The dog ran straight up to Karen's car as she slowed down, its paws hitting the side of her vehicle as it barked wildly. Karen rolled down her window, and the dog's eyes locked onto hers, full of desperation and something that almost looked like hope. "What's going on with you, huh?" Karen murmured, more to herself than to the dog. She could feel her gut telling her that this wasn't something she should ignore. The dog barked once, then darted a few steps ahead before turning back to look at her, its tail wagging in short, frantic bursts. Karen had seen this behavior before, dogs leading their owners to show them something, but she'd never seen it like this, from a dog that didn't belong to her. This can't just be a coincidence, Karen thought, her instincts kicking in. She flipped on her hazard lights and began to follow the dog slowly in her car. The dog kept running a short distance ahead, stopping every few seconds to glance back and make sure Karen was still following. Each time their eyes met, the dog would let out a bark, as though urging her to hurry. Meanwhile, the scene began to draw attention. A few cars slowed down to see what was happening. Some drivers parked on the side of the road, their curiosity piqued by the sight of a dog, seemingly leading a car. "What's going on there?" one driver asked another, who was standing on the sidewalk watching. "I don't know," the other replied. "That dog's acting strange, though. It's like it's trying to tell her something." The murmurs grew as more neighbors stepped out of their homes, drawn by the sound of the dog's frantic barking. Children stopped playing and tugged on their parents' sleeves, pointing at the unusual sight. Some people began to follow on foot, their curiosity overpowering their hesitations. Karen's focus remained on the dog as it led her through the neighborhood. It darted down a narrow residential street where the houses grew older and the trees thicker. The further they went, the quieter the surroundings became. The sounds of suburban life, children laughing, cars honking, lawnmowers humming, faded into the background, replaced by the crunch of gravel under Karen's tires and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The dog's urgency seemed to grow with every step. It started barking louder, its movements becoming more animated. It sprinted ahead a few times, only to stop suddenly and turn around, as though afraid Karen might lose sight of it. Karen pressed down harder on the accelerator, keeping pace with the animal while trying to ignore the growing unease in her chest. "What are you trying to show me?" she muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. As the road narrowed further, Karen decided to call it in. She pulled out her phone and dialed the local police department, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. "I know this sounds strange," she began, "but there's a dog leading me somewhere, and it's acting like someone's life depends on it. I think I need backup." The dispatcher, used to hearing unusual calls, didn't hesitate. "Understood. We'll send a unit to your location. Stay safe and keep following." By the time Karen hung up, the dog had led her to the edge of the neighborhood, where the paved road gave way to an overgrown trail. It wasn't a place people visited often, thick with weeds, tree roots jetting out at odd angles, and patches of uneven ground. The trail was rocky, darkened by the shadows of dense trees overhead, and it had an almost eerie quality to it. Karen parked her car, stepped out, and grabbed a flashlight from her trunk. The dog, sensing her willingness to continue, barked excitedly and bounded ahead onto the trail. By now, 2 patrol cars had arrived, their red and blue lights flashing in the distance. A pair of uniformed officers stepped out, looking perplexed as Karen waved them over. "What's going on?" one of them asked. Karen quickly explained. "This dog, it's been acting like it wants us to follow it. I've never seen anything like it. Whatever it's leading us to, it's urgent." The officers exchanged glances but nodded. They trusted Karen's instincts, knowing her reputation for following hunches that often turned out to be right. Together, they followed the dog into the trail, their flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The dog, now clearly relieved to have reinforcements, barked with renewed energy and picked up its pace. It bounded over tree roots and patches of bramble, pausing occasionally to make sure the humans were keeping up. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew heavier. The sounds of birds and insects that usually filled the area were conspicuously absent, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. Karen felt a knot forming in her stomach, her every sense on high alert. "What are we walking into?" one of the officers muttered under his breath. The dog seemed to sense their unease and let out a series of high-pitched barks, as though reassuring them to trust it. Then suddenly it stopped. The dog stood frozen at the edge of a steep ravine, its ears pricked forward and its tail rigid. It began barking hysterically, its body vibrating with urgency. Karen and the officers rushed to its side, shining their flashlights down into the ravine. At first, they saw nothing but tangled tree branches and scattered debris. But then, faintly, they heard it, a cry for help. Over here, a weak voice called out, barely audible over the rustling leaves. Karen's flashlight caught the glint of metal, and her breath caught in her throat. There, wedged between 2 large trees at the bottom of the ravine, was a car. Its front end was crumpled against a trunk, the windshield shattered. Inside, a man was slumped over the steering wheel, his face pale and streaked with blood. "Call an ambulance!" Karen shouted, already moving to assess the situation. The dog barked furiously, pacing back and forth along the edge of the ravine. It seemed almost frantic now, as though urging them to act quickly. "Hang on," Karen called down to the man. "We're coming to get you." The moment the officers saw the wreckage down in the ravine, everything fell into place. This wasn't just a desperate animal causing a scene. This was a heroic, intelligent dog that had led them directly to save a life. The car, a silver sedan, was barely visible among the tangled trees and brush. It was crushed at the front, its hood crumpled against the thick trunk of an oak tree. The windshield was shattered, and the roof was slightly caved in. Inside the car, they could barely make out the figure of a man slumped forward against the steering wheel. His face was pale, streaked with dried blood from a gash on his forehead. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, but he was clearly weak, disoriented, and unable to call out loudly for help. He had been trapped there for hours, isolated and helpless. The dog, standing on the edge of the ravine, barked and whined urgently, pacing back and forth as if to say, "Hurry up, he doesn't have much time." Its ears were pinned back, and its eyes darted between the humans and its trapped owner, brimming with desperation and loyalty. Karen immediately snapped into action. Pulling her radio from her belt, she called for reinforcements. "We've located the vehicle in the ravine. One male occupant appears to be trapped inside, injured. Requesting EMS and a technical rescue team immediately. The terrain is steep and hazardous." The other officers assessed the situation, shining their flashlights down to get a better look. The incline was steep, covered in loose rocks and slick with damp leaves, making it a dangerous descent. But there was no time to waste. "All right, let's figure out the safest way down," Karen said, scanning the area for a path. The dog let out another sharp bark, drawing her attention. It trotted a few steps to the left, where the incline was slightly less treacherous, and stopped, looking back at her expectantly. Karen couldn't help but smile, even in the tense situation. "Looks like you've got all the answers today, huh?" she said to the dog. Meanwhile, more officers and rescue personnel began arriving on the scene. Flashing lights from police cars and ambulances illuminated the once dark trail, and the area buzzed with activity. Paramedics began preparing their gear, while a specialized rescue team assessed how to safely reach the man. The dog stayed close, watching every move. It was as if it understood that these people were here to help, and it wasn't going to relax until it saw its owner safe. "This dog is incredible," one of the rescue workers said, shaking his head in disbelief. "If it weren't for him, who knows how much longer that man would have been stuck down there." Karen nodded. "He didn't just come to get help. He led us here with purpose. It's like he knew exactly what he was doing." The rescue team worked quickly but carefully, securing ropes and harnesses to ensure a safe descent. The terrain was as tricky as it looked. Loose rocks shifted underfoot, and the thick brush made progress slow. But the rescuers were determined, spurred on by the dog's unwavering devotion. As one of the paramedics descended into the ravine, the dog whined softly, its eyes never leaving the vehicle. Karen crouched down beside it, placing a reassuring hand on its head. "They're going to get him," she said gently. "You did your part. You were amazing." The dog responded with a soft lick to her hand before turning its gaze back to the scene below. When the first rescuer reached the car, he called out to the man inside, "Sir, can you hear me? We're here to help." The man stirred slightly, letting out a faint groan. It was clear he was dehydrated, in pain, and barely conscious, but the sound of his voice was a relief to everyone watching. "He's alive," the rescuer confirmed through his radio. "But he's in rough shape. We'll need to stabilize him before moving him out of here." The dog barked loudly, almost as if it understood the update, and was cheering them on. Back at the top of the ravine, the paramedics prepared a stretcher and other medical supplies, lowering them down to the team below. Karen watched as the rescuers worked with precision, carefully extracting the man from the mangled car. The process was slow. Every movement had to be deliberate to avoid further injury. The dog grew more animated as the rescue progressed. It paced in small circles, its tail wagging nervously, and let out occasional barks, as if encouraging the team to keep going. Karen and the other officers couldn't help but marvel at its intelligence and determination. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the rescuers managed to free the man from the car. He was carefully strapped onto a stretcher and secured for the climb back up. The dog, sensing that the critical moment had arrived, stood completely still, its ears perked and its eyes focused entirely on its owner. As the team began to hoist the stretcher up the incline, everyone held their breath. The climb was slow and precarious, with rescuers carefully navigating the slippery ground while keeping the stretcher stable. The dog edged closer to the slope, its body tense with anticipation. When the stretcher finally reached the top, the dog let out a series of excited barks, its tail wagging furiously. It rushed to the man's side as the paramedics began assessing his condition, licking his hand and whining softly. Despite his weakened state, the man managed a faint smile and murmured, "Good boy, you saved me." The paramedics worked quickly, administering first aid and preparing the man for transport to the hospital. He had several injuries, cuts, bruises, and what appeared to be a broken leg, but the fact that he was alive was nothing short of a miracle. The dog refused to leave his side, even as the paramedics lifted the stretcher into the ambulance. Karen spoke to one of the medics. "Can we bring the dog along? I think he's earned the right to stay with his owner." The medic smiled. "I don't see why not. He's part of the reason this man is alive right now." As the ambulance doors closed, the dog hopped inside and settled next to the stretcher, resting its head on its owner's chest. The sight brought tears to the eyes of many who had gathered to watch. It was a moment that encapsulated the unbreakable bond between a dog and its human, a bond so strong that it had driven this brave animal to do the unimaginable. Karen stood by, watching as the ambulance drove away, its sirens fading into the distance. She let out a deep breath, her heart full of gratitude and awe. Turning to her fellow officers, she said, "That dog didn't just save his owner's life. He reminded all of us what true loyalty looks like." As the crowd began to disperse, Karen took one last look at the trail, where it all began. She knew she'd never forget this day, or the dog that became a hero. The man, later identified as 42-year-old Michael, was rushed to the hospital with multiple injuries but survived. He had crashed his car while swerving to avoid a deer and had been trapped for hours with no way to call for help. His dog, Max, had been with him in the car but had managed to escape through a broken window. Despite being disoriented and frightened, Max had found his way to the main road and done everything in his power to get help. News of Max's heroic actions spread quickly, and he became a local celebrity. People couldn't believe how determined and intelligent he had been. But for Michael, Max wasn't just a hero, he was family. If this story warmed your heart, make sure to subscribe for more incredible animal stories. And don't forget to watch the next video for another amazing tale.